So I remember to start at the beginning. You know, it used to be a time that I would look out on my screen and I would see everybody. Now all I see are names or pictures of some kind. You know, it was bad enough that I have to see you guys this way. But now not even able to see anybody. My goodness. All right, I'll let you get away with it. I don't know how you're dressed or what you're up to at the moment in front of the screen. You know, there was an unfortunate event the other day in which a couple was, there was a Zoom of a bar mitzvah, and there was a couple that were involved in activities that really not appropriate for a bar mitzvah, and they forgot to turn the camera off. So I have no, I'm not judging anybody being doing such things, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, we'll begin first of all with a summary of this week's coming week's Torah portion. There we get it out, right? Parshat Naso, and it continues the idea of counting. At the end of last week's Torah portion, we were counted the Levites and assigning them of their various duties. And so the Torah portion continues this week with that a numbering and assigning of various responsibilities to the Levites when the camp was broken down, and taking utensils and carrying them, what have you. One of the things that we have, though, in this passage, in this text, is the only example in the Torah of what would be considered to be a trial by ordeal. And that's in the case where a woman was suspected by her husband of having been unfaithful. He accuses her of her conjugal infidelity, but he's got no proof. So his only recourse is to bring her to the sanctuary where she undergoes this ordeal. And you can read up on it. It's in chapter 5, those who want more details on it. But I want to just make a couple of points. One, as some moderns suggest, the fact that she has a guilty conscience, if she indeed did something wrong, that would affect the outcome of this ordeal. And hence its efficacy, because it describes her drinking this mixture of dust from the floor and barley. Not a pleasant mixture, but not one that really would cause any harm to anybody. And the Torah suggests that if she was guilty, something like that would happen. If she were innocent, then she would not only be free from any kind of punishment, but she would be blessed to have children. Now, what's interesting that I want to say is the rabbis said that this ordeal went out the door later on. Why? Not because they were concerned with what we today would see a problematic kind of proving guilt or innocence, but because they said that men were not being faithful, and they were not doing right, and this only worked when everybody was being faithful and upright in terms of their lives, which is a convenient way of, I think, of just eliminating the ceremony. They couldn't just eliminate it, but they said because the change in sexual morality, people were not properly behaving, therefore this can no longer take place. We then have what is called the vow of the Nazir, the Nazarite. It has nothing to do with Nazareth, Nazareth in the north, thus with any connection to Jesus or Christianity. It was a person decides to be extra careful in their lives and to dedicate themselves to God in a special manner. They would take this oath and this vow, which was minimum of 30 days. And during that 30-day period, they had to avoid grapes and any products that come from the grape, hard liquor, as well as wine. Be especially careful about avoiding ritual impurity, and went through a special ceremony and then and not shaving or cutting their hair during that period of time. You may recall that when we read the story about Samson, Shimshon, Samson was made a Nazir from his birth. All right? And then we're now moved to when Moses finishes setting up the tabernacle, and there is a series of dedicational offerings that were brought by each of the tribes of Israel. Each one of the chieftains was to bring for their tribe. And except for the names that are found, they're identical. So you're reading through this Torah portion, 12 passages that essentially are the same. You know, couldn't we have just said, so-and-so brought just like everybody else, or they say, this is what they all brought, and not go through it each time. And it's suggested by the rabbis, this was to emphasize the importance of every person's gift, that we don't want to shortchange anyone by not giving them full credit for what they did. And so we have quite a long passage, which is clearly repetitious because there's nothing new being added to the story. Right, so that is the portion that is the Shabbat. All right. And now today, two things we're going to start with mysticism and also I hope to get in the part that we missed on the class about Jewish ethics. Did you want to say something, John Lakin? Or you just have your microphone on?
Oh, sorry about that.
That's okay. I don't mind. It's just all of a sudden I disappear and this blank screen with your names on it pops up.
We're trying to fix the camera, but it's broken.
Okay. I'll let you get away with it. Good excuse. All right. All right. Okay. Mysticism, first of all, is very much a universal idea. It's not unique to Judaism. There's Christian mysticism, there's Buddhist mysticism, there's mysticism that is not related to any particular religions that we know of. But Jewish mysticism has at its core must relate to Jewish tradition. So what is mysticism? First of all, it's a desire to achieve a direct experience of God. And the mystic sees the world as being more than what is simply visible to the naked eye or perceived with the physical senses. There is a scientific view of the world. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, essentially. The mystic says there are many things that you cannot see, you cannot touch. And these things are just as real as any physical item that we may come across. Also, there's a tendency in mystical circles to have entities that are part and parcel of this mystical world. You may not be perceivable to the normal senses, but they exist and are there. And that certainly becomes as its place in part of Jewish tradition. Now, we do know that there were mystical expressions of Judaism that date back to the 1st and 2nd centuries in the Common Era. And there were works that are called as the Hechalot, or the Chariots of God texts, and also Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. The mystics contemplated the God's temple, God's home, as it were, and they sought to have visions of that, and as well as the Merkavah, the divine throne that is described by the prophet Ezekiel in his famous opening vision. And some of the great sages of the Talmud are assumed and mentioned to be involved with mystical experiences. One of the most important figures was Rabbi Akiva, who is clearly on the mystical end of things. Also, one of his later students, of Shimon ben Yochai, was also, there. Hi, I can see you. Nice to have a face out there. All right. So we'll come back. Shimon ben Yochai, there are a few stories found here and there in the Talmud. And one of them, probably the stories I'm sure has popped up sometime in the course of the year, how Rabbi Akiva and Ben Shimon, Rabbi Akiva, Elisha ben Avoya, oh boy, Ben Zoma and Ben Zakkai were gathered together and went on this mystical journey. And a result of that mystical journey, one committed suicide, one went crazy, Elisha ben Avoya abandoned Judaism, and only Rabbi Akiva came out unscathed. So it was thought to be something that was the esoteric wisdom that you were supposed to be very careful of. And for that reason, for many centuries, this kind of mystical tradition was supposed to be relegated to people of age, 40 years of age before you were supposed to start studying in the mystical realm, at least seriously. Excuse me. And so it was there, but it did not take a primary place in Jewish life. And indeed, the role of philosophy was what really the main intellectual addendum to the basic Jewish study format. Now, for example, Maimonides, the Rambam, right? He was a rationalist. We talked about him last week in philosophy. But his vision of God is a very philosophical, but it's not personal. His vision of God is the prime mover, the force behind the universe, the unmoved mover, the perfection. God could only contemplate himself. He has to deal with issues. How could God communicate with the world? Because of that vision of God. It's not, for those who like to intellectualize, it may be a very good way of expressing the divine. But for people who wanted more of a personal feel, a personal relationship to God, certainly the Maimonidean explanation of the divine was not something that the masses could necessarily relate to. Now, a little bit later than Maimonides is Rav Moshe ben Nachman, the Ramban, with an N at the end. By the way, I said Ben Zakkai, it was Ben Zoma and Ben Azai that I should have said before. All right. So the Ramban, who was a Spanish exegete, also a Talmudist, and he was clearly part of this mystical tradition. In his commentary on the Torah, he often alludes to certain mystical interpretations without going into detail. He doesn't elucidate what he's really saying. Basically, he's saying, if you know what I'm talking about, then you know what I'm talking about. So for those of us who have no idea what he's talking about, that becomes problematic. But that was the nature of mysticism. It was really maintained in small circles. Now, when we think of mysticism today, though, We don't think so much of Nachmanides. We don't think much of a lot of the other forms that mysticism took, but we think of a mysticism that centers around the work called the Zohar, the Book of Splendor. And that is the central text of what we of Jewish mysticism from then on. Once it comes to be revealed in the end of the 13th and 14th century, and those practitioners of that form of mysticism are known as Kabbalists. And that's why today, the shorthand name for Jewish mysticism is Kabbalah. Kabbalah really means tradition, acceptance of the tradition. And what happened was, this book, the Book of Splendor, Sefer HaZohar, was supposed to have been written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was active in the 2nd century of the Common Era, as I said, one of the students of Rabbi Akiva. And he is mentioned in the Talmud as a mystic. It is written, supposedly is written by Shimon Bar Yochai as a commentary on the Torah, but a commentary based upon a mystical understanding of the Torah. Now, most modern scholars assume that it was not written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, while it may contain material that goes back centuries. The general accepted opinion is that Rabbi Moshe de Leon, Rabbi Moses de Leon, who is the popularizer of this work, either compiled it, brought together different materials and edited it in some way, so that the Zohar is his creation, although it probably does contain material that was old and part and parcel of the tradition of the mystics up until his day. One of the reasons why they make this claim, amongst other things, is that it's written not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic, but it's seems to be a kind of a fake Aramaic. And it's not the Aramaic of the Talmud or the Babylonian Talmud or the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud Land of Israel. It apparently has some anachronisms in it. But in any case, this was accepted by mainstream Judaism as being a holy work, and some even allow their decision-making in Jewish law to be influenced by what they read in the Kabbalistic literature surrounding Sefer HaZohar. Now, according to the Zohar, although it's not unique to the Zohar, Torah study can proceed along 4 levels of interpretation. It's called the Pardes because of the names of the different ways of doing it. The 4 levels are Peshat, the literal, straightforward meaning of the text. You read a story, and when it says Abraham takes Isaac and puts him on the wood on the altar, and he raises his hand to bring down the knife, that's what it means. That's straightforward. Remez. Remez means allusions, that there's something being alluded to here. It's more than just the story of Abraham bringing his son on the altar. And these allusions may talk about the struggles between, this is my reading, not necessarily what the Kabbalah said, but the struggle to overcome the urge to sacrifice that which is most dear to you to God, to the divine. And when Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac because God tells him not to sacrifice Isaac, it says that is not the way we should view the world. The third way of interpreting is drash, to inquire, seek out meaning. This is what the Midrashic literature is, comparison from different places to others, similar words and wording, and the basis for some of Jewish law. And finally, there is sod. Sod is the secret, mysterious, inner esoteric meanings that are found in the Torah and expressed in the Kabbalah. Kabbalah by its followers is assumed to be a necessary part of the study of Torah. While you have to study all of Jewish tradition, the Kabbalistic literature becomes something very important in the way they approach what is the full meaning of Judaism. And the Kabbalah was not accepted by everyone, even till today it's not, but it became a very, very strong force in Judaism. Even the more rationalistic halachas often were Kabbalists. One of the great pre-moderns or early modern sages, the Vilna Gaon, wrote commentaries on some of the Kabbalistic works. And still to today, we find the influence of Kabbalah, and now even beyond the original meanings of it, we see in neo-Hasidism, the modern non-traditional forms of Judaism that are seeing in the Kabbalah a means of seeing the world. They don't necessarily accept all of the ritualistic ideas that are underneath it, but they see in some of the Kabbalistic notions expressions of the world that they can very much relate to. Now, the Kabbalah really reached the masses with the coming of the Hasidic movement. Hasidism owes a lot to the Kabbalistic traditions. And so much of what the Kabbalists have to teach, the Hasidic masters have to teach, grows out of some of the Kabbalistic ideas. We see the real flourishing begin in Israel in the 16th century. This is after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And there was a very strong feeling about those Spanish Jews that they'd gone through a life-altering experience. Just like those of today might view the Holocaust, so many of them viewed what they had undergone. And they sought in the mystical tradition to try and understand and find a way to deal with the worsening of the galut, the exile. The Gerush Safard, the exile of the Spanish Jewry, was in their minds something that, in a sense, God himself experiences. When Israel went out and were expelled from the land, both in the first temple time and the second temple period, we find already references to the idea that God, the divine presence, followed Israel when they left the land of Israel. And God too, though, therefore feels this sense of being in exile. As you see already, now this is a very different God imagery from that of which Maimonides or the rationalists would come up with. And they express this in a manner which I'm going to try and explain tonight, which is kind of an overview of the it's an amalgamation of various Kabbalistic approaches. Okay, that ends up in what we call today Lurianic Kabbalah. When you talk about Kabbalah, you're usually talking about essentially Lurianic Kabbalah. But just to set the stage, these exiles in the end of the 16th century, it's already 100 years. 1492 was the expulsion from Spain. And one of the most important leaders of this Kabbalistic circle in the city of Tzfat was a man by the name of Rabbi Moses Cordovero. He was born in 1522 and died in 1570. Right? And he wrote a work called Pardes Rimonim. Pardes, remember, again, that was the 4 ways of examining the Torah. Pshat, literal meaning. Remez, that's allusion. Drash, interpretation. Homiletic interpretation. And Sod, mystical interpretation. He also wrote a very well-known ethical tract called Tomar Devorah, which is still very well received in mystical circles. But the man that we're going to talk about and try to examine a little bit is a man called Isaac Luria, or he's also referred to as the Ari. Interestingly enough, Ari means Ashkenazi, the Rabbi Yitzchak. Tells you that his ancestry is not Sephardic, but Ashkenazi. But he was apparently a very charismatic individual, and his import, his stamp on Kabbalah became the most important, at least for the general audience of the world. And what he understood begins with creation. Before the world is created, the universe comes into being. All there is the divine, the Ein Sof, the infinite. Ein Sof is what's used in Kabbalistic terminology, means without end. Now, in order for the physical world to come into being, that requires some kind of removal of the divine. It means making a space available. It means opening up. And the only way it can open up is called tzimtzum, contraction. Not contracting inward, which is one of the ways they talk about how could God be apparent in the tabernacle. The original meaning of it was God, as it were, contracted himself so that his presence was there between the wings of the cherubim on the top of the ark. But instead of coming inward, God expands outward. But not that he's expanding anywhere, because all there is God. But he's creating a gulf. He's creating an absence. He's creating a vacuum of the divine. And into that vacuum of the divine, as the first act of creation, is a ray of light that comes from the divine into the middle of this emptiness that is going to be our universe. That's because one of the problems that the mystics have and that others have is, if God is divine, God is infinite, how can that which is divine and infinite really come into contact in any shape or form with the finite, the non-divine? And so the Kabbalists understood it as rays, as it were, of light coming in to this void. And that plays off the fact that in the opening of Genesis, Breshit, it says the world was tohu vavohu, and what we understand is void without form. All right. So now this ray was supposed to be organized in a certain manner. And that's a way that is very popular understanding of a symbolism of Jewish mysticism. Okay, just a second. That's not what I want. Sorry, just a second. iPhone pad, right? thought this would work this way. Just a minute. I even had already sitting here, but I didn't. Okay. See if this works. I don't know. Can you see anything on here right now?
Just a blank screen, like a white screen.
Blank white screen. Okay, let's see if I can get it up here. Oh, yeah. I'm adding it. Want to add it to Kabbalah. It's not going to work. All right, so we will have to try a different route. Hold your horses. Don't go anywhere. That's not working. It's not working, ladies and gentlemen. All right. I'll have to send it to you at another time. But it's the 10 Sfirot. The ancients spoke of the universe as being a series of spheres, Sfirot, and each sphere contained part of the universe. And that's turned on its head in this formulation, so that it was understood to represent the divine, the Godhead, as the modern books would speak of it. It doesn't mean God is made up of 10 different things, because God is not, God is one, but it came into being, meaning that this is how God was expressed in the world. And so what would be is that these different Sfirot were to be arranged in a kind of a format, which is called by the Kabbalists Adam Kadmon, the first human being, first Adam, and the emanations of light that were coming from God were supposed to come into the universe, or come into this entity that we have, and it was they were to be captured. Some of the let's start back. Here's this ray, as it were, coming into the universe. As it comes into the universe, the original plan was that the first sphera, this divine aspect of God, was to capture part of that light, and then the rest of it was supposed to continue onward to the next, and would eventually till it reaches the point where it comes into the world that we know. And that was the design that was supposed to be. All right, all 10 sphirot were supposed to capture part of the divine light. Then the world, as we wanted it, as he wanted, God wanted it to be, would come into being. But something went wrong, catastrophically wrong, which is a problem in and of itself. How does God do something that comes out wrong? That's their problem to explain. But what happens is, instead of these sphirot capturing the emanations from God, they shatter, they break, and they become little shards of broken sphirot, broken material, as it were. And this broken material captures some of the sparks, the netzitzot, the divine light. They're called klipot, and the klipot capture some of these divine sparks. And the world in which we live is really the world of netzitzot, the shattered vessels. And what God had originally intended was that Adam HaRishon, the first human being, would observe God's mitzvot, his commandments, and thus the sphirot would be put back together properly. But instead, he sinned. And since he sinned, the world was not established the way it was supposed to. And therefore, throughout the ages, the Jews were called upon to perform the mitzvot. When we perform the mitzvot properly, then the sparks, or at least some of the sparks, are allowed to return to the sphirot. And eventually all of them would return, and thus the world would put into the being the way it was supposed to be. But so now, what we see is a very powerful idea that we human beings can actually affect the divine. We are capable of making a partnership with God. We are capable of restoring what God wanted it to be. We are also capable in some way of influencing God. And we perform a mitzvah. We do it in the proper manner, with a proper kavanah. Then we are partners with God in restoring the world. Okay. Now, that means you have to be very careful to do the mitzvah the right way. And that's why in some prayer books they have before mitzvot, the recitation, the blessing for a mitzvah, have what is called in Hebrew kavanah. The kavanah is meant to say, behold, I'm prepared to perform the positive commandment of X, Y, or Z. And in order to reunite the Yud Hey and the Vav Hey. All right, I'll come back to that in a moment. And then by reciting that formula, we put the blinders on our eyes in a sense that we are directed the way we're supposed to be going, performing the mitzvah. So that's just one part of this understanding. Now, furthermore, this catastrophe of the exile, the catastrophe of the breaking of the Sefirot, also means to a certain extent that God himself, as it were, is not complete. Jewish tradition speaks of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, praised be He, the Yud He Vav He, in English, or which we usually read as Lord, as being male. And when we say that creation has in it this idea of two sides, a male side and a female side. That's why he says God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him male and female. Well, that is part and parcel of the divine balance. Now, the last of the Sefirot, which is also called Malchut, kingship. As I said, I'll send you this thing later on. You have Keter, the supernal crown. Then you have Chokhmah, wisdom, Bina, understanding, Dat, intellective knowledge, Chesed, or kindness, Gevura, Din, or justice, Rachamim, mercy, Netzach, victory, eternity, Hod, glory, or splendor, Yesod, foundation, and Malchut, the last of the Sefirot. And this sphere, the last of the Sefirot, this Malchut, which is the closest to the world in which we exist, is feminine. And it represents the feminine aspects of the divine. And with the breaking of the Sefirot, there's this idea that there's this gulf between God up here and his Shekhinah, his divine presence here. Okay? So there's a distance. God is, the Shekhinah is an exile from God. And there are all kinds of imagery that is then built upon this construct that there are two aspects of God that need to reunite. First of all, you can see it has a very sexual connotation. And indeed, you may have heard the idea that there's a special mitzvah for a husband and wife to have sexual relations on Shabbat. The mystics of Tzfat took that literally because they saw in the divine act of a man and a woman uniting in the act of love a repetition or a reclamation or a reenactment of what they hoped would be the coming together of the two aspects of the divine Shekhinah and the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And indeed, this influences lots of things. Later on, when the Sabbatean heresy that we mentioned a while back came into being, they made use of this imagery in not necessarily such a nice way, etc. There's much more to the Kabbalistic notion of the world and many things there, but eventually what happens is you have a very esoteric theosophic understanding of Kabbalah. And then unfortunately, you also develop a very earthy, magical kind of understanding of Kabbalah. So that rabbis were writing amulets, protective amulets. There was thought that if you knew the right Kabbalistic formula, you can do all kinds of things. Magic becomes associated with it, becomes popular in the non-Jewish world. And Christian Kabbalah comes into being. At the beginning of the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, as the Haskalah movement came into being and modernity became a very important aspect of that understanding of the world, there was a very marked tendency to see Kabbalah as merely being a form of superstition. But we know that there are different aspects to it. And if one sees in the major understanding of it as a human connection with the divine, that's a very important understanding, I think, of it. But also has this idea of a mystical world. It has an idea that there's the good side of things, and there's the sitra acher, the other side, the bad side. And that introduces more of the ideas of demons in the world, and that you have to fight off these demons and deal with them. I just realized, I don't know, this is what I was trying to talk. I don't know, can you see this? Does it make any sense? There's a backwards for you. Yes, no. This is the divine Kabbalistic notion. Like I said, I'll send it out to you later. And it is still very important, as I said, in the Hasidic world. All right. I want to spend a little bit of time tonight while my voice is still holding out to talk about Jewish ethics. Now, there are some who basically would suggest that really Jewish law is Jewish ethics, where the law tells you what to do. That is, in and of itself, how we should view the ethical imperative. Something here. I gotta say nothing's working right tonight. Alrighty. I'll try again with something else. Okay, hey, worked this time, didn't it? Yeah, so yeah. Oh, well, I'm thinking that. Let me see. Maybe I can still do the other one too. You think by now I'd know how to do this, but you know. This one appears soon. He'll finally. Okay, that was what I was trying to talk about before. All right. So just to review, this imagery is frequently found when talking about Kabbalah. Keter at the top, crown royalty. The next level is governed by Keter, and there's Chokhmah on one side and Bina on the other, wisdom and understanding. And they come together in Tiferet, glory, God's glory. Then you have chesed, kindness or loving kindness. Gvura, might, or also is understood as being justice. So if you go to either extreme, that's not good. Chesed, too much chesed is not good for the world. You need a certain level of discipline. As, raising a child, we all know that. But if you're too strict, too harsh, you're missing the boat too. So that comes together in Tiferet. Netzach, eternity, hold glory. Together they have the Yesod, the foundation, and then down here Malchut. But you see, there are ways of relating from Keter straight down to Malchut. Netzach influences Yesod, Tiferet in Netzach, Chesed in Netzach, Chesed in Chochmah. All these things, when these forces going back and forth, for the Kabbalists, they have meaning. Okay? Indeed, when we counted the Omer, Sfirat Omer, one of the traditions was to relate two of these items to each day of the Omer. Chochmah shebeketer, wisdom that is in Keter. Bina shebeketer, understanding that is in the crown. Chesed, all these kinds of things are expressions that relate to each other and have to do different days of the counting the Omer. All right, but what I want to get here to start with, this is I never thought about it until just recently when my colleagues, Rabbi Wayne Allen, mentioned it to me. First of all, there's a concept in Jewish law that says, Kol tadir mechavero kodem et chavero. Any mitzvah is more frequent than another mitzvah precedes that other mitzvah. Right? And they fill in the words in the middle. If the opportunity to fulfill one of them coincides with the opportunity to fulfill the other. Sometimes you can only do one thing. You have to make a choice. And that which is done more frequently takes precedence over that which is done less frequently. For example, putting on the talit and the tefillin. Since the talit is put on every day and tefillin are not put on Shabbos and Yom Tov, you put the talit on first. And then there are others along those lines having to do with, it says anyone who's more sanctified than the other precedes the other. It has to do with sacrifices. And now we come to the part that I want to touch on. So it says in that Mishnah, Ha'ish kodem la'isha. The man precedes the woman. La'achayot la'hashiv avedah. When it comes to rescuing or returning a lost item. Right? The assumption, which I'm not trying to defend or deal with any other way, except note it, as the commentary suggests, that because men fulfill more mitzvot, they're more important in that sense. So therefore, a man takes precedence of rescuing of a life before a woman, okay? And also of his lost objects, etc. But that's not complete. Because it then goes on and says, Isha kodemet leish lichsut lo tziami beit hashavi. He says, and a woman precedes the man in regard to which of them to provide with a garment first, because her humiliation is greater, or to release from captivity first, due to the concern that she will be raped. Okay? The idea that a woman is more embarrassed by being naked means if you have a choice, you only have one garment to give to two naked people, one a man, one a woman, you give it to the woman first. She takes precedence. Furthermore, because we know the unfortunate reality of captivity and unfortunate of war, as we are hearing even now in Ukraine, women are subject to terrible abuse during war. And so if you're given the opportunity to ransom a captive, a female captive or a male captive, the woman comes first. All right. And then it goes on to say, interestingly, when they are both subject to degradation, that is, they're concerned that both the man and the woman would be subject to rape, the man proceeds the release of the woman. Since the understanding, the assumption is that although as horrible as it is to be raped, the natural act, if I can use those terms, okay, of a man raping a woman is a vicious way of doing something which is an act of love, but it's normative. But with a man, the only way to do it is anal intercourse, which is not normative, at least in the eyes of the rabbis. But what I want to point out is that we start with, even though we think, ethics are clear cut, different situations call for different responses. Right? That under certain circumstances, we follow different sets of rulings because the circumstances are different. Right? So we always have to understand that, oops. All right. Where do I get back to the whole thing? Okay, just be happy I'm getting this working at all tonight. Okay, so let's look at some ideas that we find in rules of conduct in Jewish tradition in the ethical realm. In the Talmud reflects on the idea that a person who is an innocent bystander, who finds himself in the presence of a person who's in peril, being in danger of being victimized by a crime or some other distress, whether it be natural or catastrophe. Maimonides codifies this in his code as if one person is able to save another and does not save him, he transgresses the commandment, neither shall you stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Right? If you see somebody in distress, you have a positive biblical obligation to help that person. And if you don't, then you are guilty of committing a sin. Right? Similarly, Maimonides writes, if one person sees another drowning in the sea, or being attacked by bandits, or being attacked by wild animals, and although able to rescue him either alone or by hiring others, does not rescue him. Or if one hears heathens or informers plotting evil against another, or laying a trap for him, and does not call to their attention and let him know. Or if one knows that a heathen or violent person is going to attack another, and although able to appease him on behalf of the other and make him change his mind, he talks him down, don't do this, and he doesn't, he transgresses in each case the injunction, neither shall you stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. All right, so if we see a situation in which another person is being threatened, we have the obligation to reach out and help that other person. And Maimonides goes on to quote the passage found in the Mishnah of Sanhedrin, that he who saves a single life is always preserved the entire world. Now, is there a limit to this? Do we always have an obligation to save the other person? What do you think? Make this little interchange here. Do we always have an obligation to save the other person? One head shaking there. When don't we?
Not if your life is
Well-
at risk. Not if your life is at risk.
So now, if you would lose your life in the attempt, that means 2 lives are gone. But what if maybe you'll get wounded? Say it's a battle, and it's your wounded comrade. Do you have an absolute obligation? No. You have the right to weigh the possibility of your being able to accomplish the act and save him, even at some cost to you. But if you don't, if you don't do it when you could have, with relatively minor cost to you, then you're standing idly by the blood of your neighbor. So again, we have to weigh the circumstances. We have to weigh the situation. One of these we find, some simple laws. If you find a lost object, you're supposed to return it to its owner. And so if you have to return a lost object to somebody, if you can return their life, isn't that, saving their life, isn't that indeed important? And responsibilities you have. Now, getting back to this idea of endangering your life, there's a passage in the Talmud. It says, Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, by a majority vote, it was resolved in the upper chambers of the house of Nitzchah in Lida that in every other law of the Torah, if a person is commanded, transgress and suffer not death, he may transgress and not suffer death, except idolatry, incest, and murder. Guy comes up to you and says, I know you're Jewish, you don't eat ham, eat the ham sandwich, or I'll shoot you. You eat the ham sandwich, you just don't enjoy it, right? But if he says to worship an idol, if he says to kill this third party, this innocent individual over here, if he says to commit an act of incest, adultery, of rape of another individual, then at least in theory, you're supposed to be prepared to give up your life. As one of the rabbis said, who says your blood is redder than his blood? What right do you have to preserve your life at the expense of the life of an innocent person? And so we don't have an obligation necessarily to give up our life for another, but what happens is the famous story, the Talmudic version of the story. There are 2 guys out in the wilderness, in the desert, and they have one jug of water with them. What business they have going out in the desert with only one jug of water, I don't know, but all right, that's where they are. If they both drink that water, they will both die. If one of the individuals drinks the water, that individual will live and the other person will die. What do you do? The Greek version of it was floating in the ocean. You have a piece of wood that's only allows one person to make it. So the rabbis themselves aren't of one accord on how to understand this thing. The son of Batura taught it's better that both should drink and die rather than one should behold his companion's death. He says, it's just not right for you to live at the expense of the other person. Rabbi Akiva comes along and says that your brother may live with you, it says in the Torah. Meaning your brother may live with you, but not instead of you. Your life takes precedence over his. So that, if I, and eventually he says, if it's my water, I have the right, at least in theory, to drink the water. One of the examples that the rabbis deal with those is very problematic, and you have this all the old-fashioned westerns. The city is surrounded by a bunch of bandits, and they're going to capture the town and kill everybody. But they say, look, if you send out Shmerel and give him to us, we'll kill him and let you go free. Are you allowed to send out Shmerel? Well, so the rabbis generally seem to be leery of such an easy arithmetic. And so some say, first of all, if it's not clear that they're going to be able to get into the city and beat you, then you can't do it. Others say, if they're already in the city and it's clear they got the upper hand, you can do it. Some say no. Others say, if Shmerel really is guilty of something, and if we took him to court, the court would convict him and impose the death penalty, then you could do it. Again, the easy cases are very easy to answer. The ones that have no clear-cut answer, what is the best way of dealing with it? Jewish tradition struggles with it. I'm running out of voice, so I just want to touch upon a couple of other ideas here. What if you can save another person's life by donating an organ? Your kidney. What's your obligation? Right? Do you have an obligation to do so? Most rabbinic opinion bifurcates the answer this way. You're not obligated. In other words, we can't say to you, we will force you, compel you to do this. But if you can do it, and the risk to you is minimal, then you should do it. But every operation carries with it a level of risk, a level of pain. And so it might not be so simple. That idea of it is modern, but we find in the 14th century the following: if a tyrant says to a Jew, "Allow me to amputate one of your limbs," which represents no danger to life, "or else I will kill your fellow Jew." Some authorities say that he's obligated to allow his limb to be amputated since he would not die. This is quoted in the name of Rabbi Menachem Rakanti, early 14th century. And so while it's not exactly our modern transplant of organs, it is kind of relating to it. And 250 years later, this whole thing again comes up in a response. A question was asked of the Radbaz, Rabbi David Ben Zimri, who dies in 1573, asking, what does he feel about this case? And refuting the proof text offered by his Italian predecessor, Rabbi Ben Zimra maintained that no precedent could be cited for such an obligation. Indeed, there was always the possibility of an operation of this kind might prove to be dangerous to the life of the individual. And he concluded, "Moreover, it is written, their ways are ways of pleasantness," referring to the Torah. "The laws of our Torah, therefore, must be in consonance with reason and intelligence. How can one imagine that a person would allow his eye to be blinded or his hand or foot to be cut off so that his fellow not die? It's just not reasonable. I therefore see no justification for his decision. It is an act of saintliness, midat chasidut, and happy is the man who can live up to it. Now, see, he's bifurcated. There's no obligation here. But certainly I understand how that could be a true act of loving kindness on the part of the person. If, however, if there's a possible risk of life, then one who agrees to the amputation is a foolish saint, called chassid shoter, foolish saint. There's nothing saintly about a fool. Okay? For the possible danger to oneself takes precedence over the certain danger to one's fellow. So we have many laws talking about proper behavior on a very strict level. We have some that are go beyond that. There's a famous line. It says in Vayikra, "You shall not insult the deaf, nor place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord." And that's very clear, at least in modern interpretations, to mean, if somebody can't hear you curse him, that doesn't mean you should curse him. The fact that they don't hear it is irrelevant. Furthermore, when somebody cannot see a danger, you have an obligation not to cause that person to fall by that danger. And we're told, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord. We have an obligation to reach out to others around us. There's an interesting interpretation. It says, if you go to borrow something from your neighbor, can I borrow your rake? And the guy says, no way, I'm not going to lend you my rake. And a few days later, he comes along to you and says, can I borrow your shovel? And you say back to him, sure, I'm not like you who would lend somebody something. That's bearing a grudge. Right? Just to this sort of thing. In the rubric of Jewish ethical behavior, there's also this idea of tsar balei chaim. The Torah permits us to make use of animals. We're allowed even to kill animals for food and clothing. But there also is a principle that we may not impose extra suffering on God's creatures. One of the examples given in the Torah is you're not allowed to plow with an ox and a donkey together, because the difference in strength that between the two animals will cause suffering to the donkey. Or when you're threshing your grain, and they often use animals to thresh the grain, they would trot over it, or they would pull a sledge. You're not allowed to muzzle the animal. The animal has to be able to eat some of the grain while it's doing it. So that's one of the reasons why, despite we can't eat an animal they kill in hunting, that's why many rabbis forbid hunting, because there's no way we're getting benefit from it. We're slaying innocent life and for no good reason. Further, that's, by the way, one of the reasons why a lot of my colleagues and a lot of other observant Jews will no longer eat veal. That the way veal is produced causes unnecessary suffering on the behalf of that calf. So we do not eat veal. I don't say it's not kosher, but I would say it's not the proper way. and then opens the doors to all kinds of questions on modern agriculture as well. So when we come down to ethical behavior, Jewish ethics, we have to remember there's also a concept, lifnei mishurat hadin, going beyond the letter of the law. We have a responsibility to look beyond our own interests, especially when it is not a terrible loss to us and is important to somebody else. For example, there could be a case in court. There's a rich man and a poor man. And the judge has to rule in accordance with what is just, what is correct. So he can say, yeah, the poor man, he owes the rich man money. He ran into his car, he scratched his, whatever he did. He's responsible. And he can't say he's not responsible. But he can then turn to the rich man and says, you know, this guy over here hasn't got the money to pay you. Why don't you just ignore it? Go beyond the letter of the law. So many arguments and fights are because people want to go by the letter of the law when they're missing what it's meant to really bring about. And we are told to be holy. Kadoshim tiyuhi kadosh anochi. You shall be holy, for I am holy. And holy means to look for others and help others the best that you can. And finally, the last basic area that is the areas of tzedakah. You know, there's a mitzvah to provide for the needs of the needy, the poor. Now, that's one kind of thing that we have to do. But there's also a concept called gemilut chesed, acts of kindness, act of loving kindness. These are actions that have nothing to do with the monetary situation of the other person. Tzedakah is generally seen as I give money for a person who's poor. But if I give condolences to a person who's had a loss, it doesn't make a difference if he's rich or poor. I'm doing an act of kindness. Otherwise, the difference between tzedakah and gemilut chesed is tzedakah is only something you can do for the poor, while gemilut chesed is something you can do for everyone. There's never someone out there in the world who you can't help in some way, some fashion, some act of kindness. Okay, now we are getting close to the end, ladies and gentlemen. Where's my calendar here under this pile of papers that I have here? Next week, June 15th, we are scheduled to talk about Tisha B'Av, the minor fasts, the calendar. June 22nd is the final exam. I would like to, and we mentioned it, and we're going to have a picnic barbecue at my home, God willing. Let me just double check the date here. Calendar, where far out there, calendar? Okay. June 15th. Something's not right here. Yeah, 15th. Yeah, all right. So the last class is the 22nd. So I'd like to invite you to come to my home on the 26th. That's Sunday. You can think about it between now and next week. For 1 o'clock for a barbecue lunch. I'll ask you to contribute $5 a head if you're going to be able to make it. If you have any special requirements other than kosher and dairy, but if you are vegetarian or something like that, you need something like that, let me know. And we make arrangements, veggie burgers and what have you. And God willing, the weather will be nice enough. We'll be outside on the patio, and we can at least see each other in person one time. Okay? So next week we have class. The following week we will have the exam and final summation of the class. And then the following Sunday we will get together and you'll eat burnt hamburgers and charcoal browned hot dogs. Okay? All right, so I will see you all next week, please God. Have a good week. And off we go. Good night.
Can I talk to you before you go?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm on holidays, June 22nd. I'll be out of the country. So how can I do that?
Well, unless you come back and do it, you can't.
Yeah.
If I pick another date, there'll be people who can't make that date.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that. If you can't make it, I'm sorry that you can't. Okay. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Okay. Bye.